That Saturday morning, I only meant to open my hangar door and check the airplane before a weekend flight. But Valerie Whitmore, the president of the homeowners association next door, came at me like I had broken into something that belonged to her. She looked me up and down, asked me who I worked for, and then called the police when I would not leave. 10 minutes later, a patrol car rolled in, and Valerie folded her arms and smiled like she had already won. Then the airport manager stepped out of his truck, looked straight at her, and said, "You called the police on the man who owns this hangar? If you enjoy the kind of turnaround that makes an arrogant person go completely quiet, stay with me and follow this story all the way to the end." My name is Desmond Raines. I am 47 years old. I run a small aviation logistics consulting firm out of 2 offices and a laptop, and for most of my adult life I have been the kind of man who fixes things himself. Before the consulting work, before the contracts and the invoices and the phone calls with cargo carriers, I spent 11 years as an aircraft maintenance technician. That means I still know what a torque wrench feels like when a fastener is 1/4 turn from where it should be, and it means that when I own an airplane, I am the one under the cowling with a rag in my back pocket. I mention this because it matters to everything that happened. The way I look when I work is the reason a woman decided she already knew who I was. 8 months before that Saturday, I bought Hangar 14B at Redwood County Executive Airport. It is not a glamorous building. It is a 1970s steel structure with a bifold door, a concrete floor stained by decades of other people's oil, a small back office with a window unit that rattles, and a corrugated roof that I had resealed myself in the first month. The purchase was straightforward and boring, which is how I prefer my purchases. I bought the structure outright, and along with it came a long-term ground lease with the County Airport Authority, 30 years with an option to renew, recorded and filed and stamped in 3 different places. The land underneath belongs to the airport. The building on top of it belongs to me. Here is the part that turned into the whole problem. Hangar 14B sits at the far northeast corner of the airport property, and directly on the other side of our service road and a line of ornamental hedges is a residential development called Stonehaven Ridge. Big houses, wide driveways, matching mailboxes, a stone monument sign at the entrance with the name carved into it, and a homeowners association that governs every single thing inside its boundary. The service road runs right along the property line, close enough that if you drove it without a map, you would assume the whole row of hangars was part of the neighborhood. Several residents assumed exactly that. They watched airplanes taxi past their back fences, and they decided that the hangars were an amenity of their community rather than an operating airport that had been there since long before the first foundation was poured. I did not buy the hangar to impress anybody. I needed a place to keep my airplane, a Beechcraft Bonanza that I fly for work and for the pleasure of flying, and I needed a secure spot for equipment, spare parts, and a couple of pallets of cargo netting and load restraint gear that my clients sometimes need on short notice. That is the entire reason. No trophy, no statement, no plaque with my name on the door. Just a building where my things live and where I can spend a Saturday morning with a coffee going cold on the workbench while I check a magneto. The first time Valerie Whitmore saw me, I was wearing jeans that had lost their color at the knees, a gray work shirt with the sleeves rolled, and I had a smear of oil across the back of my left hand. I had my pickup backed up to the open hangar door, tailgate down, because I was moving 2 toolboxes and a case of oil. It was a Tuesday, around 10 in the morning, and I heard a car door shut behind me and turned around to see a woman in her early 50s in white slacks and a linen jacket walking across the service road with her sunglasses pushed up into her hair like a headband. Her first sentence was not, "Are you the new hangar owner?" It was not, "Hi, I live over there, nice to meet you." What she said, with her chin slightly lifted and her eyes already moving past me to the inside of the building, was, "Does your boss know you're parking here?" I stood there for a second with a quart of oil in my hand and let the sentence finish landing. There was no confusion in her voice. There was no question in it, really. She had already decided who I was, and she was simply informing me of her conclusion. "There's no boss of mine anywhere on this property," I said. It was true, word for word, and it was also the most honest thing I could have said without handing her the answer she never asked for. She glanced at my pickup, an 11-year-old 3/4 ton with a dented rear bumper and a magnetic sign I take off on weekends, and then she looked back at the hangar. "So you're the mechanic," she said. "Not a question either. I've got work here," I told her. I said it the same way I would have said it to anyone, calm, unbothered, already turning back toward the tailgate. I have learned over the years that calm is the one thing certain people cannot tolerate. Anger they can use. Explanations they can twist. But calm just sits there and refuses to give them anything to grab. I could feel her irritation increase. She wanted a reaction and she was not getting one. She stood there for another moment, and then she said the sentence that told me exactly what the next few weeks were going to look like. "Nobody operates in this area without my association knowing about it." Then she turned around and walked back across the service road to her white sport utility vehicle, and I watched her go and thought, well, all right. The paper appeared 8 days later. I pulled in on a Wednesday afternoon, and there was a laminated notice taped to the outside of my hangar door, dead center, at eye level, with a bold heading across the top that read, "Homeowners Association Architectural Violation." Underneath were 3 bulleted items. 1, the hangar door color was, and I am quoting the document, not consistent with the approved community palette. 2, a personal work vehicle had been parked in view of residential sight lines for an extended period. 3, exterior storage containers were negatively affecting the aesthetic character of the community. At the bottom there was a line for a correction deadline and a warning about escalating assessments. I stood in the sun and read the whole thing twice, and I laughed out loud, alone, in front of my own building. That door had been that exact shade of faded industrial white since before Stonehaven Ridge existed as anything other than a soybean field. The storage containers were 2 toolboxes and a rolling parts cabinet, all of them on airport pavement, on land that no homeowners association in this county has any authority over. It was like getting a parking ticket from the man who runs the hot dog cart. So I did the reasonable thing first, because I almost always do the reasonable thing first, and because I have learned that documentation matters more than satisfaction. I went home, sat down, and wrote a short, polite email to the address printed at the bottom of the notice. I wrote that Hangar 14 B is located on Redwood County Executive Airport property, that it is not within the boundaries of Stonehaven Ridge, that I hold the structure and a recorded long-term ground lease with the airport authority, and that the association therefore has no architectural jurisdiction over the building. I asked her courteously to review the boundary map on file with the county. I thanked her for her time. I signed it with my first and last name. There was no apology. There was not even a pause for consideration. Valerie replied in under 2 hours, and her answer was a paragraph about how the association has both the right and the obligation to protect the shared visual identity of the community, and how properties that are visible from residential lots fall within the scope of that obligation, and how she trusted I would cooperate. Nowhere in it did she address the boundary. Nowhere in it did she use the word airport. She wrote to me the way a person writes to a contractor who has questioned an invoice. 4 days after that, she came in person again. I was inside the hangar with the door open, sitting on a stool with a maintenance log across my knee, and I heard her heels on the concrete before I heard her voice. She did not step fully inside, which I noticed. She stood at the threshold with her arms crossed, and she said, "You'll need to move those things before Friday." Not please, not would you. The tone of a woman reading out an assignment. I closed the log and looked up at her and asked, honestly curious, "And if I don't move them?" She lifted her eyebrows like I had said something charming and stupid. "Then we'll contact the owner." I want to be very clear about what I did next because some people will say I should have simply told her. I almost laughed, and then I said, "You should do that. That is all. I did not say I am the owner. I did not pull out a lease." And I let her walk away, believing she had just threatened me with the thing that would put me in my place. I have gone back over that decision many times since, and I stand by it. She had never once asked me. Not on the first day, not in the email, not standing in my doorway. She had been given 3 separate opportunities to ask a single simple question, and she had spent every one of them making an announcement instead. I wanted to see exactly how far a person would travel on nothing but her own assumption, and I wanted a record of the journey. She kept traveling. Over the following 2 weeks, she appeared at least 6 times that I know of. She photographed my pickup and my toolboxes. She once stood at the edge of the apron for 11 minutes talking on her phone while looking at my building, and I know it was 11 minutes because my hangar camera timestamps everything. She left a second notice, then a third, and during one of those visits, she said something to me that I have not forgotten, and I do not expect to. She said, "I know the type of people who get hired out here. You all think that because somebody handed you a key, you can do whatever you want." She never used a slur. She never said anything that a lawyer could hold up and point at cleanly. She did not have to. It was in the way her eyes moved over my hands, in the way she spoke over me and then waited as though she had allowed me a turn, in the confidence of a woman who had decided at first glance which side of a fence I came from and had never revisited the question. There is a particular kind of contempt that arrives dressed in professional language, and anyone who has been on the receiving end of it recognizes it instantly, even when it cannot be quoted. Then one Friday morning I drove up and there was a brand new sign bolted to the frame beside my hangar door. Metal, not paper. Green and cream, matching the Stonehaven Ridge monument at the neighborhood entrance, with white lettering that read, "Authorized Stonehaven personnel only." Somebody had drilled 2 holes into the steel frame of my building to mount it. That was the moment the whole thing stopped being funny to me. I took it down. I did it carefully, with a socket, and I kept the sign, the bolts, and photographs of the fresh holes in the frame. Then I sat in my truck and called Graham Hollis, the airport manager. Graham is 58, built like a man who used to load freight, says about half as many words as the situation requires, and knows the ownership file on every structure on that field better than he knows his own phone number. I had dealt with him during the purchase and during the roof permit, and he had always been exactly as helpful as the rules allowed, and not 1 inch more, which is the highest compliment I can pay an administrator. I described the sign. There was a pause on the line, and then Graham said, "The association has no authority to mount anything on your hangar, or on my frame, or on my fence, or on my pavement." I asked whether he thought I should escalate it, file something, make it formal. He said, "Send her a letter first. In writing, keep a copy." Then he added something I had not expected, and it changed the shape of everything I understood about the situation. He said, "She's already got the boundary map. I sent it to her myself about 6 months ago." 6 months. Half a year before she ever laid eyes on me. It turned out that the association had submitted a request to the airport to install decorative gates, a camera pole and signage near the service road, framing the corridor as an entrance feature for the neighborhood. The airport had declined, in writing, because the corridor sits inside an airport easement that must remain clear for operations, emergency access, and maintenance vehicles. Graham had attached the boundary survey to that denial, so there could be no confusion about where the line ran. Valerie Whitmore had received it, opened it, and replied to it. So she was not simply an uninformed neighbor with an overactive sense of ownership. She had been told. She had documentation in her own inbox that drew a red line between her authority and my building, and she had chosen to behave as though it did not exist. That reframing did something to my patience. Up to that point, I had been treating her as a person operating on bad information. From that call forward, I understood that information had never been the issue. I sent one final email, and I made it as clean and as unarguable as I could. I attached the recorded boundary survey. I attached the first page of my ground lease with the airport authority, with the parcel description and the structure identification visible. I stated, in plain sentences, that the association had mounted signage on privately owned property without consent, that I had removed it and retained it, that I expected no further physical alteration to my building, and that any further correspondence regarding jurisdiction should be directed to the airport authority. I ended by noting that I preferred to resolve the matter without involving counsel. Her reply was one sentence. The association does not recognize your interpretation. I read it 3 times. There was no interpretation. There was a survey with coordinates on it. But that sentence told me what she actually wanted, which was not a resolution and not even a correction. She wanted the last word on who decided things in that corridor, and she was willing to be factually wrong in order to keep it. What she could not tolerate, I think, was not the signage or the toolboxes or the color of a door. It was that a man she had filed under hired help had told her, in writing, that she did not have the authority she believed she had. The next week I found that the auxiliary padlock the association had once put on the service gate had been replaced with a new one, a different brand, shiny, with no key given to anybody at the airport. It did not actually stop me. I have a gate code for the main operations entrance, and I always did, but that was never the point of that lock. The point of that lock was to establish, physically, that somebody with a key decided who appeared in that area, and that somebody was not me. It was a small act, and small acts tell you more about a person than large ones. I did not retaliate. I thought about it, and then I opened a folder on my laptop and I started filling it. Every email, in full, with headers. Photographs of every notice, with the date visible. The mounted sign in the drill holes, the new padlock. Hangar camera footage exported and saved, not left to overwrite itself on a 30-day loop. A simple text file where I logged the date and time of every appearance she made on airport pavement. I was not building a lawsuit. I was building a record, because I had learned by then that this was going to end in a room where somebody would say, "It never happened." The last email arrived on a Thursday evening. It said, "If I find you at that hangar again without the owner present, I will call the police." I read it twice, standing in my kitchen with the refrigerator humming behind me. Then I typed a one-word reply and sent it. Understood. I saved a copy of both, and I will admit something here. A part of me hoped she would do it. Not because I wanted a confrontation, but because I had spent 2 months being polite to a woman who would not read a map, and I had begun to suspect that the only document she would ever accept was one delivered by somebody she considered an equal. Saturday morning came clear and cool, one of those mornings where the air is so still that you can hear a single-engine airplane 3 miles out. I had a flight planned for the afternoon, a short hop to see a client about a warehouse contract, and I got to Hangar 14B at about 7:30 with a thermos and a pre-flight checklist. I opened the bifold door, and the sun came in across the concrete and lit up the Bonanza's polished spinner, and for about 20 minutes it was the best part of my week. I pulled the cowl fasteners, checked the oil, ran my hand along the leading edge of the right wing looking for anything new, and made 2 notes in the log. Then I heard the tires. The white sport utility vehicle came up the service road faster than anybody should drive on airport pavement, and stopped at an angle behind my pickup, close enough that backing out would have been a conversation. Valerie got out. She did not say good morning. She did not say anything about the weather or the airplane, or the fact that it was 7:50 on a weekend. Her first words were, "What are you doing here?" "My work," I said. I stayed where I was, standing near the workbench with a rag in my hand. She stepped up to the threshold and looked past me into the building, and I watched her see the bonanza properly for the first time. Polished aluminum, clean paint, a set of chocks under the nose wheel, and a tow bar leaning against the wall. Whatever she had imagined was in that hangar, it was not that. She recovered fast. "Where is the owner?" I said, "Right here." 3 feet from her, looking directly at her, with my hand on my own workbench. And she heard it, I am sure she heard it, and then she did something I still find remarkable. She discarded it. Her face did not change. She simply routed around the sentence like water around a stone, because the sentence did not fit the story she had already written, and she said, "I need to see your employee authorization." Not identification. Employee authorization. Even then, standing in the doorway of a building I owned, hearing me say the words, "She could not get there." "No," I said. "I'm not going to do that." She pulled out her phone and lifted it, and I heard the little click of a camera app opening, and she began narrating for the recording in a raised, formal voice, announcing the date and the location, and stating that an unauthorized individual was trespassing at a hangar adjacent to the Stonehaven Ridge community and refusing to leave. I did not cover my face and I did not step out of frame. I leaned back against the workbench, crossed my arms, and let her film. Then I said quietly, "I'd check on a few things before you make that call." "You think I won't?" she said. And there it was, the whole thing in 4 words, because she had stopped caring about the hangar entirely and was now only interested in whether I believed she had the power to do it. "Do whatever you think you need to do," I told her. My calm convinced her. I could see it happen on her face. She decided I was bluffing, that a man who was really allowed to be there would have been loud, would have produced something, would have been afraid. She dialed the non-emergency dispatch line. I stood there and listened to the whole call, and it was an education. She gave the address of the neighborhood entrance rather than the airport. She described me as an unauthorized male inside a hangar, refusing to provide authorization, previously warned multiple times. And she said, with real conviction, "I'm the president of the Homeowners Association, and I'm responsible for security in this area." That last sentence was doing an enormous amount of work. She was not lying about her title. She was simply attaching it to a jurisdiction she had invented. When she hung up, she looked at me and said, "They're on the way. I need you to step outside the hangar and wait." I said, "No, you don't have the right to refuse." I looked at her for a moment and I said, "You're about to find out exactly who has what rights on this pavement." She laughed at that, a short exhale through her nose, and went back to leaning against the front of her vehicle, with her arms folded, guarding the exit of a building she had never once been invited into. We waited 11 minutes. I finished my oil check, because there was no reason not to. Somewhere in the middle of it, a small airplane departed off runway 24, and we both watched it climb out over the hedges, and it struck me as absurd that a woman who lived 400 feet from a runway threshold had convinced herself that she was in charge of the airfield. Then the patrol car came up the perimeter road with its light bar dark, and Valerie straightened up and smiled and said, "Now you can explain it to them." 2 officers got out. The first was a woman about my age, maybe a little younger, name tape, reading bell. She had that particular unhurried body language that good officers have, the kind that says nothing is going to be decided in the first 30 seconds. The second was a man named Ellison, broader older, who took one look at the hangar, the airplane, the service road, and the 2 of us, and visibly filed the whole thing under civil dispute before his door had finished closing. Valerie went straight at Officer Bell, talking before the distance closed. She said I had been warned repeatedly, and in writing. She said I was not a resident of Stonehaven Ridge. She said I had refused to leave the hangar area when instructed. She said, and this was the phrase she kept returning to, that she did not believe I had any right to be there. She spoke quickly and cleanly, the way somebody speaks when they have rehearsed, and she spoke as though the officers had arrived to execute a decision she had already made. Officer Bell let her finish. Then she asked one question. "Do you own this hangar, ma'am?" Valerie did not blink. "The association manages this area." Bell's expression did not change at all. She said, "That wasn't my question." And I watched something come loose in Valerie's posture just slightly, the first hairline crack in 2 months of certainty. It is a very particular experience to see somebody realize that the authority figure they summoned is not automatically on their team. Bell turned to me. "Sir, do you have documentation showing you're permitted to be here?" "I do," I said. I did not raise my voice, and I did not make a speech. I have watched enough of these situations go sideways to know that the man in my position gains nothing from theater. I took out my wallet, handed over my driver's license, and then opened my phone and pulled up the scanned lease and the structure purchase documents I had kept in a folder for exactly this reason. Valerie could not stand it. She cut in over my shoulder. "Him having a key doesn't prove anything. Anyone can have a key." Officer Bell raised a hand about 6 inches and said, "Ma'am, let him speak." Then, to me, "Go ahead." I said plainly, "I own Hangar 14 B. I own the structure and I hold the ground lease from the County Airport Authority. I've owned it for 8 months. Valerie laughed. Not a big laugh, not a performance for the officers. It was a small, private, contemptuous sound, and it was the truest thing she said all morning. "You own this?" she said. "Yes," I said. "And you expect us to believe that?" I looked at her and I let the pause sit for a second, and then I said, "I don't need you to believe it." Officer Ellison, standing to the side, shifted his weight. He heard that exchange for what it was. So did Bell. I saw her eyes move from Valerie's face to mine and back, and something in her assessment of the morning changed permanently in that second. Valerie's temperature went up. She said the officers needed to remove the trespasser and address the situation, and she said it in a tone that implied they were being slow. But Bell had already recognized the shape of what she was standing in. This was not a simple trespass with a clear complainant and a clear property owner. This was a competing claim about who controlled a piece of ground, and she was not going to sort that out on the word of whoever had spoken first. She stepped away, keyed her shoulder microphone, and asked dispatch to verify the parcel and to contact airport operations for the field. I knew exactly who airport operations would send on a Saturday morning. I did not say a word. I put my phone back in my pocket and picked up my thermos, because it was going to be a few minutes and my coffee was still warm. Valerie noticed my composure, and for the first time she looked at me with something other than dismissal. She looked at me like a person doing arithmetic she did not like. Officer Bell came back and said, to both of us, "The airport manager is on his way out." Valerie said quickly, "That's fine. Graham and I have spoken before." I looked at her over the top of my thermos and said, "Good, you should stay." Graham Hollis arrived 4 minutes later in a white operations pickup with an amber beacon on the roof and the county seal on the door. He parked square, not at an angle, took a folder and a tablet off the passenger seat, and got out with the unhurried gait of a man who has been called out to many stupid situations and has learned to arrive at all of them at the same speed. Valerie moved toward him immediately, wanting to be the first voice, wanting to frame it. "Graham, finally," she said. "I've been trying to deal with this individual for weeks now, and this morning he refused to." Graham was not looking at her. He was looking past her at me, and he said, "Morning, Desmond." 2 words. Valerie stopped talking, just stopped, mid-clause, and I watched her recalculate the entire morning in the space of about 2 seconds, because there is no version of an airport manager greeting a trespasser by his first name that leaves her story standing. Graham turned to Officer Bell. "What do we have?" Bell said, "Ms. Whitmore reported that Mr. Raines is trespassing at Hangar 14 B. Graham looked at Valerie. Then he looked at the hangar, at the open door, at the airplane inside, at the pickup and the toolboxes and the drill holes in the frame where a sign used to be. Then he looked back at Valerie and he said it, evenly, without any particular pleasure, which somehow made it land even harder. Trespassing? Desmond Raines owns Hangar 14 B. Nobody said anything for a full 3 or 4 seconds. Officer Ellison made a small noise in his throat and looked at the pavement. Officer Bell's pen stopped moving. Valerie's arms, which had been folded across her chest for the better part of 20 minutes, came down to her sides. Then she tried to save it, and the way she tried told me everything about how her mind worked. "You mean his company leases it," she said. "No," Graham said. "He represents the owner. He's here on behalf of somebody." "No." Graham lifted his hand and pointed, not dramatically, just clearly, at me. "He is the owner." Valerie changed arguments without acknowledging she had lost the first one. She said the association still had a legitimate interest and a degree of authority because the hangar was attached to Stonehaven Ridge, because it sat directly against community property, because it was visible from residential lots, because the corridor functioned as part of the neighborhood. Graham let her finish. Then he opened his tablet, turned it around, and held it up at chest height where all 4 of us could see it. It was the recorded boundary survey. The airport property was shaded, the easement corridor was hatched, and a heavy red line ran along the northeast edge, marking the limit of Stonehaven Ridge. Hangar 14 B sat well inside the airport side of that line, with the service road and the entire easement between it and the association boundary. It was not close. It was not arguable. There was no interpretation available to any person with functioning eyes. Then Graham said the second thing, and this was the one that actually took her legs out. "Valerie, I sent you this exact map 6 months ago. February. Attached to the letter denying your gate and camera request, you replied to that email." Officer Bell wrote something down. Ellison looked up from the pavement, and I stood there and watched a woman understand that the record had been kept by somebody other than herself. Bell turned to her and asked the question directly, in the flat tone officers use when they want an answer they can put in a report. "So you were aware the association doesn't own or control this area?" Valerie said she had been acting out of concern for security, that there had been vehicle activity at odd hours, that residents had raised questions, that as president she had an obligation to respond to those concerns. It was not a bad answer. It might even have worked, if she had ever once said good morning to me. That was when I finally spoke up for myself, and it was one sentence. "Security or control?" She looked at me and did not answer. So I took out my phone again and I said to Officer Bell, "There's one more thing you should probably see." I pulled up Thursday's email and turned the screen toward her, and she read it out loud at half volume the way people do when they are checking their own eyes. "If I find you at that hangar again without the owner present, I will call the police." Bell looked at the email. Then she looked at me. "And you're the owner?" "I am," I said. Valerie was not smiling anymore. I thought that was the end of it. I genuinely did. I was already thinking about my afternoon flight and about whether I would have to file a complaint over the drill holes or just fill them with sealant and let it go. But Graham was not finished, because Graham had spent 40 minutes of his Saturday driving out to an easement he was responsible for, and now he was standing on it, and he had noticed something on the way in. He turned and walked back down the apron toward the service gate, and the rest of us followed, because at that point nobody knew what else to do. He stopped at the green and cream sign standing on a 2-post steel frame beside the gate, the twin of the one that had been bolted to my building, and he said, "Who put this here?" Valerie said, after a pause, "The association had it installed." Graham crouched, looked at the concrete footing, and said, "When?" "In the spring." Then he stood up and looked at the top of the light pole beside the gate, where a small white camera housing was zip-tied to a bracket with a conduit running down the pole and into a junction box that was very clearly newer than everything around it. "And that?" Valerie said the association had installed the camera as well for resident safety, and that it only monitored the corridor. Graham said nothing. He walked the fence line about 40 feet, looking at the ornamental fence panels that Stonehaven Ridge had installed to dress up the corridor, and he checked something on his tablet twice. I understood then that the story had turned over completely, and that I was no longer the subject of it. Graham came back and said, in the same level voice he had used the whole morning, the sign footing, the camera pole bracket, and about 60 feet of that decorative fence are all inside the airport easement. Every one of those installations is in the corridor that has to stay clear, and every one of them was in the request the airport denied in February. Right about then, a gray sedan pulled up on the neighborhood side, and a man in his early 60s in a fishing hat got out. Warren Keene. He had been on the Stonehaven Ridge board for something like 14 years, longer than Valerie by a wide margin, and he had heard that police were at the hangars and had come to see. He walked over, took in the scene, and asked what was going on. Graham explained it in about 9 words, and Warren said the thing that ended Valerie's morning for good. He said, "I raised this at 2 separate meetings. I said we didn't have authority out here, and I asked to see the airport's written approval." He looked at Valerie. "You told the board that airport management had verbally approved the installations." Graham's head came around. He said, very quietly, "I never approved anything. I denied it in writing." Warren took his hat off and rubbed the back of his head and looked at the ground, and I have rarely seen a man look so tired and so unsurprised at the same time. Officer Bell closed her notebook. She said that this had moved well past anything she could resolve at the scene, that there was no basis whatsoever to ask me to leave my own property, and that the encroachment issue was a civil and administrative matter between the association, the airport authority, and the county. She gave me an incident number and told me to keep it. She told Valerie, in language that was polite but impossible to misread, that filing a police report about a property owner on his own property was not something to repeat. Valerie tried to leave. She said she had another commitment, that clearly there had been a failure of communication somewhere, that she would take it up with the appropriate parties. I did not stop her, and I did not say anything as she walked to her vehicle, because there was nothing left for me to add, and I had learned a long time ago that the moment you gloat, you hand the story back to the other person. But as she opened her door, Graham said, without raising his voice, "Valerie, we need to talk about that gate on Monday." And on Monday, the association sent me an email. It was not an apology. It was a notice of assessment in the amount of $5,000. I read it in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, and I did not feel angry so much as I felt a kind of clinical fascination. The document listed 4 grounds: disruption to the residential community, failure to comply with association security protocols, actions detrimental to the visual character and reputation of the community, and my personal favorite, hostile interaction with the association president during the performance of her duties. There was a payment deadline, a note about interest accruing, and a paragraph about potential lien proceedings. I understood exactly what I was looking at. She had lost in front of 2 police officers, an airport manager, and a board member on her own pavement, in her own neighborhood, in about 40 minutes. She could not undo any of that. So she was attempting to convert a public defeat into a paper victory, because a document with a letterhead on it can be waved around at a board meeting and described as enforcement action, and most people never read past the letterhead. I did not call her. I did not call her because a phone call leaves no record, and because arguing with Valerie Whitmore had never once produced a result. Instead, I spent 1 hour that evening assembling a single document, and I sent it to every member of the Stonehaven Ridge Board of Directors, individually addressed, with the property manager and the association's council of record copied. I attached the recorded boundary survey, the first 3 pages of my ground lease with the airport authority. The bill of sale for the structure. Every email Valerie had sent me, in chronological order, unedited, including the one threatening to call the police. Photographs of the notice taped to my hangar door, the sign that had been bolted to my building, the drill holes in the steel frame, the replaced padlock on the easement gate, and the sign footing and camera bracket inside the corridor. Time-stamped video from my hangar camera. The police incident number from Saturday. And a copy of the February letter in which the airport had denied the association's installation request, along with confirmation that Valerie had received and replied to it. My cover message was 4 sentences long. I stated that I owned Hangar 14B, that it was outside association boundaries, that the enclosed record documented approximately 2 months of conduct by the association president, culminating in a false police report. And then I closed with one line that I wrote and rewrote until it was as cold and as short as I could make it. Before I respond to this assessment, I would ask the board to confirm in writing which specific provision of the governing documents authorizes the association to fine the owner of a property that is not within the association. Nobody answered for 2 days. I have been in business long enough to know exactly what 2 days of silence means. It means people are on the phone with each other, and none of those calls include the person who caused the problem. On the 3rd evening, Warren Keene called me directly. He apologized first, which I appreciated and had not expected. Then he told me that the board had just learned, that week, that the airport's February denial letter existed at all. Valerie had never forwarded it. She had never mentioned it. When the board had asked, in the spring, whether the installations were cleared, she had told them, "Airport management is cooperating." 5 words, technically not a lie about anything specific, and completely false about everything that mattered. The board had approved spending association funds on a sign, a camera, a conduit run, and 60 feet of ornamental fencing, all of it installed on land the airport had explicitly refused to let them touch, on the strength of those 5 words. Warren said the board was calling an emergency meeting. He asked whether I would be willing to attend and speak. I said I would. He said Graham Hollis had also been invited. I asked whether Valerie knew that. There was a pause on the line, and then Warren said, "Not yet." The meeting was on a Thursday evening in the Stonehaven Ridge Clubhouse, in a room with beige carpet and a long folding table and about 30 chairs. 19 residents came. Valerie sat at the center of the table with a leather portfolio and a printed agenda, and she opened by describing the matter as an unfortunate miscommunication involving a boundary ambiguity, and she said the phrase "good faith" 3 times in the first 90 seconds. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult her, and I want that on the record, because I had 2 months of material and it would have been very easy. I walked to the front, set my folder on the table, distributed 9 copies, and asked one question. What miscommunication causes a person to call the police 6 months after being sent the boundary survey by the airport manager himself? She did not answer. She looked at the portfolio in front of her, and she did not answer, and the room got very quiet, and in that silence, every person there did the arithmetic for themselves. Graham spoke next, standing, for maybe 4 minutes. He confirmed that Hangar 14B is not within association boundaries and never has been. He confirmed that I am the lawful owner of the structure and the holder of a recorded ground lease. He confirmed that the association had never been granted permission to install signage, cameras, or fencing anywhere in the airport easement, that the request had been formally denied in February, and that he had sent the survey with the denial. He confirmed that the airport was now requiring removal of all encroaching installations at the association's expense, and he noted, without emphasis, that unauthorized structures in an operational easement are the kind of thing that shows up in a county audit. The board was not angry about me. I understood that clearly, and I did not take it personally. They were angry, because they had been told they had approval when they had a denial, because they had spent members' money on installations that now had to come out at members' expense, and because their president had generated a false police report against a property owner while representing the association. That is, exposure. That is the kind of thing that costs a community real money, and every person in that room could feel it. The $5,000 assessment was voided that night by unanimous vote in about 40 seconds. Then the board passed a set of resolutions. The association has no jurisdiction over, access to, or enforcement authority within the hangar area or the airport easement. All communication with the airport authority requires prior board approval. All misplaced signage, cameras, and fencing are to be removed at association expense within 30 days. My written complaint and the entire evidentiary record were entered into the minutes. And Valerie Whitmore was removed from any role involving airport-related matters, effective immediately. She was no longer the woman standing with her arms folded, smiling as a patrol car pulled up. She sat at the center of her own table, in her own clubhouse, while a board member she had overruled for years asked her, out loud, in front of 19 of her neighbors, "Why did you call the police on a man over property you don't own?" She said she had believed she was protecting the community. Nobody wrote that down. A few weeks later, the sign came out of the corridor, footing and all. The camera bracket came off the pole. 60 feet of ornamental fence was pulled and reset on the neighborhood side of the red line, and the new padlock came off the easement gate, and the corridor went back to looking like what it had always legally been, which is a service road belonging to an airport. I drove out to Hangar 14B on a Saturday morning in early autumn. No patrol car, no laminated notices, no white sport utility vehicle parked at an angle behind my truck. I opened the bifold door and the light came in across the concrete the way it had that first morning, and I stood there for a minute with my coffee and did absolutely nothing, which is a luxury I had not had in months. Graham came by around 9 with 2 cups from the terminal machine leaned against the door frame and said, "Want me to verify that you're authorized to be in your own hangar?" I laughed harder than the joke deserved. And then, while I was standing beside the Bonanza with a rag in my hand and oil on my knuckles, exactly as I had been the first time, a white sport utility vehicle came down the service road. It slowed. Valerie looked over at me across 40 feet of pavement. She did not stop. She did not ask who I worked for. She did not ask for authorization. She just drove on, and the sound of her tires faded off toward the neighborhood entrance, and that was the last conversation we ever had. And it consisted of nothing at all. I want to be careful about how I say this last part, because it is the only part that matters to me. I did not enjoy watching her be humiliated. I have been in enough rooms to know that public embarrassment does not reform anybody, and I took no pleasure in her sitting silent at that table. What satisfied me was narrower and, I think, more important. It was that she was finally forced to learn something she had gone 52 years without learning, which is that what a person looks like tells you nothing whatsoever about where they belong, what they own, or what they have built. Valerie Whitmore saw a black man in a work shirt with dirty hands, and she decided, in less than 4 seconds, that I could not possibly be the owner of that hangar. Her worst mistake was not calling the police. Her worst mistake was that in 2 months of notices and emails and confrontations, it never once occurred to her that she ought to ask me first. So now, every time I put my hand on the door of Hangar 14B and push it up into the morning, I remember that sometimes the best answer to contempt is not an argument. Sometimes it is just standing still, keeping your records, and letting the truth introduce itself.